My name is Rachel Torres. I'm 39 years old, and I want to tell you about the afternoon the chief of medicine at Riverside General Hospital walked down the hall to my mother's office, knocked on the door, and asked her to clear it out. Not permanently, just for the next 72 hours, because they needed the space for an emergency medical coordination center, because I was running it. But I need to start where this story actually begins, which is not in a hospital hallway and not in my mother's office. It begins in a kitchen in San Antonio, Texas, when I was 23 years old and told my mother I had been accepted into the Army Medical Corps as a physician officer. My mother, Dr. Alina Torres, had spent 30 years as an internist at a civilian hospital in San Antonio. She was a good doctor, thorough, patient-centered, the kind of physician whose patients requested her by name and whose colleagues trusted her judgment. She had built a career she was proud of in an institution she understood, surrounded by the professional culture she had trained in. The military, in her understanding, was not that culture. She was not dismissive of military service in a general sense. She had treated veterans in her practice for years. She understood the sacrifice military life required. She had genuine respect for people who served. But military medicine, specifically military hospitals, military doctors, the medical system that existed inside the armed forces, this she considered a different category of institution from the civilian hospitals she knew. She said, "Military hospitals are not real medicine, Rachel." I said, "They're hospital." She said, "They treat a specific population under specific conditions with specific resources and specific limitations. It is not the same as real hospital medicine." I said, "I've done my research." She said, "You're 23, your research is incomplete." She said other things too, in the weeks and months that followed, about career trajectory, about board certification, about the professional networks that civilian medicine built and military medicine didn't, about the patients I would see versus the patients I could see, about what it meant to limit yourself to a system that was, in her view, structurally incapable of producing the kind of medical excellence she had spent her career being part of. She said all of these things with genuine concern. She was not wrong about all of them. Military medicine does operate differently from civilian medicine, and there are real constraints and real differences that a civilian physician doesn't face. She was not a careless critic. She was a careful one. She was also, in ways I would spend 16 years demonstrating, substantially wrong about the most important things. I commissioned as an Army Medical Corps officer at 23, completed my residency in emergency medicine at a military teaching hospital in San Antonio, and began what would become a 16-year career in military medicine that took me to installations across the United States, to Germany, to South Korea, and to 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, where the emergency medicine I practiced was as real and as demanding as anything that happened in the most intense. My mother knew in broad outlines where I was during these years. She knew I was deployed. She knew I was practicing emergency medicine. She called regularly, she asked about my health and my safety, she sent care packages and maintained the ordinary connective tissue of a mother-daughter relationship across the distances my career created. She did not ask much about the medicine itself. When she did, she framed her questions in the particular way of someone who has decided what something is and is asking not to revise that decision but to gather supporting evidence for it. How limited were the resources? How difficult was it to maintain your skills outside a major medical center? Were you keeping up with the literature? I answered what she asked. I did not volunteer the parts that would have complicated her framework, because I had stopped trying to complicate her framework approximately 4 years into my service, when it became clear that the complications were not landing. I want to describe briefly what those 16 years actually contained, because the description is necessary to understand what happened in the hospital. Military emergency medicine is not a reduced version of civilian emergency medicine. In certain contexts, it is a more demanding version of it. A military emergency physician deployed to a combat theater does not treat patients in a controlled environment with a full specialist backup network and unlimited laboratory and imaging resources. He treats patients in conditions that require improvisation, prioritization, and clinical judgment at a level that a civilian emergency physician, working in a well-resourced hospital with a full support infrastructure, rarely needs to exercise in the same way. I treated blast injuries in Afghanistan that required wound management approaches developed specifically for combat medicine, because the civilian literature had not yet caught up. I ran a trauma bay with supplies that would have been considered inadequate in any American hospital and produced outcomes that, when I later reviewed the data, compared favorably with level I trauma centers in the United States for equivalent injury patterns. I also, over 16 years, completed 2 fellowships, one in emergency medical services and one in disaster medicine, that gave me a specific expertise in mass casualty event management and large-scale medical coordination that very few civilian physicians, regardless of their institution or their experience, had. That expertise is what put me in the hospital in the first place. The crisis happened in late spring. I am going to be deliberately vague about the specifics because the event is recent enough that I am not comfortable with full identification, but the broad outlines are: a large-scale public health and trauma event in a mid-sized city created patient volumes that overwhelmed the civilian hospital system in a way that required external support. The Army Medical Command assigned a team to provide augmentation, and I was selected to lead it as the senior officer with the relevant disaster medicine expertise. My assignment was to Riverside General Hospital. Riverside General was a major regional hospital with a Level I trauma center and approximately 600 beds. It was, by any measure, a serious civilian institution with serious civilian physicians, exactly the kind of hospital my mother had spent her career in, exactly the kind of hospital she believed military medicine was incapable of matching. It was also the hospital where my mother had worked for 11 years as an internist. I did not know this when the assignment came through. Not because the information wasn't available, the hospital was named in my orders, but because my mother had changed positions since I had last tracked her employment specifically, and I had not put together that Riverside General was where she had landed. I found out when I walked into the hospital on the first morning of the deployment. I was in uniform, lieutenant colonel's insignia, the specific patches and identifying information of the Army Medical Corps. I was moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who has a specific job to do and a specific team to lead and a specific timeline in which to accomplish both. I was crossing the main lobby when I heard my name, not my rank, my name. I turned. My mother was standing at the elevator bank in her white coat, with a patient chart under her arm and an expression on her face that was doing several things simultaneously: recognition, surprise, the specific recalibration of someone who is encountering something they had not prepared for. She said, "Rachel," I said, "Mom." She said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I've been assigned here. My team is augmenting the hospital's capacity during the crisis. I'm the lead officer." She said, "You're here at Riverside?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I work here." I said, "I know that now." She said, "I didn't know they were sending military." I said, "It was a short notice assignment." She said, "What will you be doing?" I said, "Running the Mass Casualty Coordination Center. We need to set up a command space. The hospital administrator is working with us on that. I should get moving." She said, "Of course." I said, "I'll find you tonight if things calm down enough." I went to find the hospital administrator. The hospital administrator, a man named Gerald Park who had been managing hospital operations for 20 years, and who had the particular composure of someone who has seen emergencies before and knows that composure is contagious, had identified the space for the coordination center. It needed to be a room of sufficient size, with appropriate connectivity, in a location that allowed efficient access to the trauma bay. He had identified my mother's office, not because he knew the connection, he did not at that point. He had identified it because it was the right size, the right location, and currently occupied by a physician whose patient load could be temporarily redistributed to colleagues for the 72 hours of the acute phase. He walked with me down the corridor to her office. He knocked on the door. My mother opened it. Gerald said, "Dr. Torres, I'm sorry for the short notice. We need to ask you to relocate for the next 72 hours. We're setting up the Emergency Coordination Center in your office. Lieutenant Colonel Torres will be running the operation from here." My mother looked at Gerald. She looked at me. She looked back at Gerald. She said, "Lieutenant Colonel Torres." Gerald said, "Yes, Dr. Torres is the lead military officer for the augmentation team." My mother said, "Dr. Torres is my daughter." Gerald said, I wasn't aware of that." There was a brief silence. My mother looked at me again, not with the recalibration expression from the lobby, with something more complicated. Something that was processing multiple things simultaneously in a way that her face, which was generally controlled and professional, was having some difficulty managing. She said, "Of course, I'll clear my things." She cleared her things. I set up the coordination center. I want to describe what the next 72 hours looked like, because they are the specific demonstration of what 16 years of military medicine had produced, and because that demonstration happened in front of my mother in ways she had never seen my work before. The Mass Casualty Coordination Center is not a treatment facility. It is the operational brain of the medical response. The space where patient tracking, resource allocation, specialist coordination, interhospital transfer decisions, and real-time capacity management happen simultaneously. Running it effectively requires a specific combination of clinical knowledge and operational thinking that disaster medicine training develops, and that most physicians, regardless of their civilian credentials, do not have in a practiced form. I had run this kind of operation twice before, once in a training exercise that had been specifically designed to be realistic, and once in an actual mass casualty event during my second Afghanistan deployment, where the patient volume had been higher and the resources considerably lower than anything we were dealing with at Riverside General. I knew what I was doing. More importantly, I knew what I was doing in a way that was visible, in the specific practical way of someone whose confidence is not performed, but is the natural result of having done the thing before under harder conditions. The Riverside General physicians I was working with were serious, skilled clinicians. They were operating under significant stress, with patient volumes that exceeded their normal capacity, in conditions that were unfamiliar and demanding. They were also in the first hours doing it without a coherent coordination structure, which meant that the overall system was less efficient than it should have been. I built the structure, not by directing civilian physicians in their clinical work, that was not my role and not appropriate, by providing the operational framework within which their clinical decisions could be coordinated, tracked, and resourced effectively. By managing the patient flow information that allowed the trauma bay to function at maximum efficiency. By making the inter-hospital transfer decisions that moved patients to the right level of care at the right time. By maintaining the situational awareness that allowed the hospital's leadership to make informed decisions about resource deployment. My team worked around the clock in shifts. I worked around the clock without them, sleeping in 4-hour increments in a chair in the coordination center because the 72-hour acute phase required continuous command presence and I was the command presence. My mother was in the hospital for most of those 72 hours, not because the crisis required it, though it did require all hands, but because I think she was watching. Not in a way that was in my way, she was doing her clinical work, managing her patients, contributing to the response in the way that an experienced internist contributes to a mass casualty event. But I was aware, in the peripheral way that you are aware of people who matter to you when you are also doing something demanding, that she was present, that she was in proximity, that she was seeing. At the 48th hour mark, during a brief operational pause when patient volumes had stabilized enough to allow a 10-minute break, she appeared at the door of what had been her office and was now the coordination center. She looked at the room, the monitors, the tracking systems, the team members who were managing different streams of information simultaneously, the particular organized chaos of a command center running at full capacity. She said, "Can I bring you something, coffee?" I said that would be good, thank you. She brought coffee. She stood for a moment at the threshold, not entering. She understood instinctively that the room was an operational space and that coming inside would be entering someone else's territory. She said, "How much longer?" I said, "Probably 20 more hours of acute phase, then a drawdown period." She said, "You've done this before." I said, "Twice, once in training, once in Afghanistan." She said, "Afghanistan?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The second deployment?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You never told me what it was like." I said, "You never asked about the work specifically." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "No, I suppose I didn't." She said, "Rachel, what you're doing in there, this is, I don't have the right word for it." I said, "Operational medicine, disaster response." She said, "Where did you learn it?" I said, "Fellowships, and Afghanistan, mostly Afghanistan." She said, "They taught you this in the military." She said, "I didn't know they did this." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "I need to get back, but I'll bring more coffee in a few hours." I said, "Thank you." She brought coffee 3 more times before the acute phase ended. The crisis resolved over the following 24 hours. Patient volumes stabilized, the civilian hospital system regained its normal capacity, the external augmentation was no longer needed. My team began the drawdown process, transferring coordination responsibilities back to the hospital's own systems, documenting the operational record, preparing the after-action materials that would inform future responses. Gerald Park held a brief meeting with my team and the hospital's senior leadership before we departed. He said things that were professionally appropriate and genuinely meant about the value of the military augmentation and the quality of the work. My mother was at that meeting. She sat at the far end of the conference table and said nothing during Gerald's remarks. But when the meeting ended and people were moving toward the door, she found me in the hallway. She said, "Can we get dinner tonight if you have time?" I said, "I have time." We had dinner at a restaurant near the hospital. It was a Thursday evening, quiet, the kind of place where conversations have room to be what they need to be. She waited until we had ordered before she said anything about the preceding 72 hours. Then she said, "I owe you an apology that I should have given you years ago." I said, "Okay." She said, "I told you military hospitals were not real medicine. I said it when you were 23 and I have been saying versions of it since then." I said, "Yes." She said, "I was wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not just wrong in the way of being factually incorrect about a specific thing. Wrong in a way that was about arrogance as much as anything else." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I spent 30 years in civilian medicine and I developed a specific understanding of what good medicine looked like. And I decided without ever seriously examining my assumption that military medicine was less than that. I decided it from the outside without looking at the inside because the outside didn't look like what I knew." She said, "What you were doing in that room for the last 3 days, I have never seen anything like it. In 30 years of hospital medicine, I have never seen a physician manage an operational environment the way you managed that one." I said, "It's a specific skill set. Disaster medicine is its own discipline." She said, "I know that now. I didn't know it before." She said, "They taught you that. The military taught you that." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because they needed people. Because they operate in conditions where someone needs to be able to do that." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "When Gerald came to my office to ask me to clear it out for your coordination center." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you what I was thinking." I said, "Okay." She said, I was thinking that I had spent 16 years telling myself you were practicing a limited form of medicine in a constrained institutional environment. And then a man came to my office and asked me to give the space to my daughter because she was running an emergency coordination operation that the hospital needed. And I realized, in the time it took him to finish his sentence, that the story I had been telling myself was not the right story. I said, it took you that long. She said, it took me that long. She said, I'm sorry it took me that long. I said, I know. She said, Rachel, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, why didn't you tell me all of this, Afghanistan, the fellowships, what you were actually doing? I said, I tried at the beginning. You weren't revising the framework. She said, no. I said, so I stopped trying and did the work instead. She said, and waited for me to see it. I said, I didn't plan for you to see it in quite this way. She said, your office being the one they needed. I said, yes, that was coincidental. She said, or very good timing. The genuine one, not the performed professional one, the one I remembered from when I was a child and she was just my mother and the framework hadn't been built yet. She said, what happens next for your career? I said, I'm looking at some options. There's a command opportunity coming up and I've had conversations with a civilian disaster medicine organization that does large-scale response work. She said, which would you choose? I said, I don't know yet. I'm evaluating. She said, what would make you happy? I said, both would make me happy for different reasons. She said, then you should take the time to figure out which reasons matter more. I said, yes, that's what I'm doing. She said, Rachel. I said, yes. She said, I want to understand your work, not the framework I've been using, the actual work. Will you tell me about it? I said, yes, I'll tell you about it. She said, starting with Afghanistan. I said, starting with Afghanistan. We stayed at that restaurant until it closed. I told her about the deployments, both of them in more detail than I had ever shared, because she was asking real questions and the questions deserved real answers. I told her about the fellowship training. I told her about the cases that had been hardest and the outcomes that had been better than expected, and the moments when the skills I had built in a military context had made a difference that I was certain a differently trained physician would not have been able to make. She listened in a way she had never listened when I tried to tell her about my work before. When I finally stopped talking, she said, I have spent 30 years believing that what I know is the standard against which other things should be measured. I said, yes. She said, that's not medicine, that's arrogance dressed up as expertise. I said, it's a common thing. She said, it's not a good thing. I said, no. She said, I'm going to work on it. I said, I know you will. She said, I'm also going to tell Gerald Park that I'm available to work with military augmentation teams again if they ever come through Riverside, and that my daughter is worth requesting specifically. I said, you don't have to do that. She said, I know I don't have to. I want to. I am 39 years old. I am a lieutenant colonel in the Army Medical Corps. My mother is a physician at Riverside General Hospital, where she works in internal medicine and occasionally consults with me by phone about cases that touch the intersection of military and civilian medicine. She cleared her office in approximately 12 minutes when Gerald Park asked her to. She has never once since that afternoon said anything about military medicine not being real medicine. She asks about my work now. Real questions, the kind that require. She has read 2 of the articles I published in the disaster medicine literature. She told one of her colleagues about my Afghanistan experience in a way that, when the colleague mentioned it to me later, made me understand that she was proud in a way she had not previously allowed herself to express. I did not plan for my mother's office to be the room they needed. I did not plan for her to watch 72 hours of work she had spent 16 years dismissing as less. I simply showed up and did the job. The job happened to require her office, and her office happened to give her the angle she had never had before. I am 39 years old. Military hospitals are real medicine. My mother knows that now. It only took one crisis, one coordination center, and one chief of medicine walking down a hospital hallway to make it visible. That was enough. It has always been enough. Some truths just need the right room. There is something I did not include in the main telling that belongs here, because it happened after the dinner, and because it changed my understanding of what the 72 hours had actually cost my mother. About a week after the crisis, I received a message from a colleague of my mother's at Riverside General, a cardiologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been part of the hospital's response team and who had worked alongside my coordination center for most of the acute. He said he wanted to share something with my permission and that he hoped I would take it in the spirit it was intended. He said, I don't know if your mother told you this, but on the second night of the crisis, around 2 a.m, when the patient volumes were at their peak, I found her in the hallway outside your coordination center. She had a cup of coffee. She was just standing there looking through the window at what was happening inside. He said, I asked her if she was all right. She said yes. I asked what she was looking at. She said, my daughter. He said, I stood there with her for a few minutes, and she said something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She said, I spent 15 years telling her the military wasn't real medicine, and I've been standing here for 45 minutes watching her run something I couldn't do. I don't know what to do with that. He said, I told her she could start by telling her daughter. She said, I know. I sat with that for a long time after reading Marcus's message. 2 a.m, standing in a hallway, 45 minutes. My mother had been watching for 45 minutes at 2 a.m, holding a cup of coffee, looking through a window at a coordination center running at full capacity and understanding something that 16 years of conversations had not produced. I called her after I read the message. She answered on the second ring. I said, Marcus Webb told me about the hallway. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I was going to tell you at dinner, and then dinner became something else, and I decided to let the conversation be what it needed to be rather than adding more to it. I said, what were you thinking, standing there? She said, I was thinking that I had made a decision about your work when you were 23 years old and I had never revised it. And I was watching you revise everything in real time, the patient tracking, the resource allocation, the transfer decisions, and I understood that the decision I had made was not a decision about your work. It was a decision about my own limitations. I said, what do you mean? She said, I mean that I didn't understand what you were doing, so I decided it wasn't worth understanding. That's not clinical reasoning. That's defensiveness. I said, you're a thorough clinician. You don't usually reason that way. She said, I do about things that threaten my framework. I said, does military medicine threaten your framework? She said, it did. Because if military medicine is real medicine, serious, sophisticated, demanding real medicine, then the story I told myself about why you were limiting yourself was wrong from the beginning. And I don't like being wrong from the beginning about something important. I said, no one does. She said, I was wrong from the beginning about something important. I said, yes. She said, about my daughter. I said, yes. She said, that's the part that's hardest to sit with. I said, I know. She said, Rachel, I want to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. I said, okay. She said, were you angry these 16 years, not at the specific comments, at the pattern, the framework, the ongoing assessment that what you were doing was less than? I thought about this carefully before answering. I said, for the first few years, yes. I was angry in the specific way of someone who has been dismissed by a person whose opinion matters to them and who knows the dismissal is wrong. She said, and after the first few years, I said, I stopped being primarily angry and started being primarily interested in the work. The work was too absorbing, too demanding, too genuinely important for anger to be the main thing I was feeling. The anger became background noise. She said, background noise. I said, yes, present but not primary. She said, and now? I said, now I'm mostly interested in what comes next. The command opportunity, the disaster medicine work, the conversations we're apparently going to have about Afghanistan. She said, we are going to have those conversations. I said, I know. She said, I want to understand Afghanistan, not because I feel guilty about not asking before, though I do, but because you went there twice and did something serious there, and I know almost nothing about what that was, and you are my daughter and I should know. I said, I'll tell you. She said, everything. I said, everything I'm cleared to tell. She said, and the rest? I said, the rest belongs to the people who were there. She said, fair enough. We have been talking about Afghanistan in installments for the past 6 weeks. Not all at once. The conversations happen when there is space for them, when we are both available and the subject feels ready to be approached rather than forced. She asks questions. I answer them as fully as I can within the constraints of what I'm able to discuss. She takes notes sometimes, which surprised me the first time I noticed it. She said, I'm a physician. I take notes when someone is telling me something important. I said, Afghanistan is not a case study. She said, no. But you are important, and I'm trying to listen properly. I said, properly. She said, without the framework getting in the way. I said, that's a new approach for you. She said, I'm working on it. My mother is 64 years old. She has 32 years of clinical medicine behind her. She is not a person who revises easily. She is thorough and precise and committed to the frameworks that have served her well, and the process of identifying which frameworks have not served her well is not a comfortable one. She is doing it anyway. That is not nothing. She stood in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning for 45 minutes watching her daughter run an emergency coordination center. She cleared her office in 12 minutes when the chief of medicine asked her to. She asked for dinner and she said, I owe you an apology, and she meant both things. That is not the behavior of a person who has given up on being right. It is the behavior of a person who has decided that being right matters less than being accurate, and that accurate in this case required a significant revision. I am 39 years old. I am a lieutenant colonel in the Army Medical Corps. My mother is an internist at Riverside General Hospital who now takes notes when I tell her about my deployments. Military hospitals are real medicine. They always were. My mother is working on understanding what that means, one conversation at a time, one deployment at a time, starting with Afghanistan. That is enough. That is finally more than enough.